In this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson explains how you can know if you're conscientious or orderly, and he also talks about why some people feel a lot of guilt.
So we've done things, for example, like imagine we present people with a row of H's, N's, M's, and U's, row after row of letters, small type. You say, go through and circle all the U's. Well, obviously, you would think that that would be a task that would require diligence and industriousness. You could time how long it took people to do it. You could see how accurate they were. Correlation with conscientiousness? Nothing. Zero. It's an IQ task, as it turns out. And so the best we've been able to do so far, maybe with industriousness is, and this is so vague, it's embarrassing, is that we think that maybe industrious people find inactivity aversive. So, because they're not motivated by enthusiasm, right, for the task, that would be an extrovert, and they're not motivated by intrinsic interest in the task, that would be someone who was open, and they're not motivated by the desire to decrease anxiety or emotional pain, because that would be someone who's high in neuroticism, right, and they're not motivated by the desire to foster affiliative relationships or to compete, because that looks like it loads on agreeableness. It's something else. It does a good job of predicting military prowess, for example. We tested a number of people who worked in the US military in a number of different places. Conscientiousness was a deadly predictor of ranking in military performance in schools like the US Naval Academy, for example, and also on military bases themselves. And that kind of makes sense. I mean, the military is a conservative place. You'd expect people who are conscientious and dutiful to do better in a place like that. But so they're good at implementation, they're good at following orders, they're good at doing their duty. Now, we're starting to understand a little bit about the value concerns that conscientious people would have too. And so let's go through orderliness. So you can decide whether you're orderly or disorderly. Leave your belongings around, that you're disorderly, obviously, if you do that. Like order, well, that's a no-brainer. Keep things tidy, follow a schedule. Is bothered by messy people. Wants everything to be just right, is bothered by disorder, likes routine, sees that rules are observed, and wants every detail taken care of. You can imagine all sorts of occupations where that would be useful. Accounting, for example, or there are people who go around and check natural gas fittings and that sort of thing by a checklist. And you want someone like that in any position where careful attention to detail is absolutely vital. The question is, as we said before, what's the potential downside? So, with industriousness, we don't know anything about it. Here's the problem with conscientiousness, okay, broadly speaking. There's no theoretical model. Nobody has any idea why people are conscientious, except for the few things that I've told you. There's no neuropsychological model, because the prediction would be something like people who are higher in prefrontal cortical ability, because that's associated with planning, would be more conscientious. That's not true. There's no psychological model. That's partly because conscientiousness as a trait was extracted out of the linguistic pools that we described by factor analytic processes. Nobody predicted that would emerge as a fundamental trait. It just came out of the statistics. So there's no model surrounding it, really, and there's no pharmacological model. We don't know how to make people more conscientious, with the possible exception of drugs like Ritalin, amphetamines, that seem to be able to make people focus in more. And so maybe there's an association to some degree between conscientiousness and the ability to pay attention. But when we've used attentional tasks in the lab, first of all, they load on fluid intelligence, and second, they don't correlate with conscientiousness. There's another dead end. Very, very difficult it's a real mystery to me, because we don't have that many good predictors of life outcome. IQ, that's a good one. Conscientiousness, that's a good one. Well, what's conscientiousness? Well, we don't know. We don't know anything about it, with the exception of the things I told you, and I'm going to describe some of the other things that we found out more recently. So, okay, so what else is useful about conscientiousness? Well, it's strongly related to life satisfaction and happiness. Actually, if you look at the big five, if you look at the traits that are most correlated within the big five, conscientiousness and neuroticism are negatively correlated. Make sure I got that right. The more conscientious you are, the less likely you are to suffer from anxiety and emotional pain. And I think the reason for that, but I don't know, but I think the reason for that is that by being conscientious, you stabilize your environment. right? Because everything becomes more predictable, more scheduled, more routine. You're more likely to be successful. So if things aren't going wrong around you all the time, then you're going to be less anxious and in less emotional pain. So I don't think that there's a direct relationship between being more conscientious and less neurotic, but I think there's one that's mediated by the environment. And this is very interesting, you see, because you'll hear all sorts of social psychologists tell you that conservatives are more likely to be high in negative emotion. They're more threat sensitive, say, than liberals. But the weird thing about that is that the conservatives are not higher in neuroticism than liberals. Actually, the contrary happens to be true. The liberals are slightly more neurotic than the conservatives. And so if conservatives are threat sensitive, because that's supposed to be the theory, then why the hell don't they show up as being higher in trait neuroticism? And you could say, well, they're so effective at their conservatism that they've reduced their neuroticism by organizing their environment. And to some degree that's true, but Jesus, if your theory predicts one thing and the opposite happens to be true, you can't just post hoc say, well, there's some other reasons we didn't pay any attention to account for that. Like, it's really bothered me because it does seem to be the case that the political landscape is shaped to some degree by some sort of negative emotion that's broadcast at the people who are on the other side of the political spectrum. But the evidence that it's anxiety related seems to be very, very thin. So the question is, well, what else might there be? So, well, conscientiousness is related to depression and guilt. There's a researcher named Fayard who used a meta-analysis to show that conscientiousness was associated with specific emotions and overall negative emotion, but was most strongly associated with guilt. It was negatively related to guilt experience, but positively related to guilt proneness. And so maybe guilt is the emotion that you feel when you don't do your duty, something like that. And that's partly why we were thinking as well, it's not exactly why we were thinking that conscientiousness is motivated by inability to tolerate inactivity, but it's a finding that's along the same sort of lays out the same sort of theoretical territory. So you must know people, maybe the person is your mother, or perhaps it's your father. They come over to your place or you go over there and they're just working all the time. They can't sit down and relax. They just work all the time. And they'll tell you if you ask them, well, I can't stand sitting around. I have to be doing something. And you can imagine too how that might have been selected for across the evolutionary time span. I mean, if you're living in a situation where resources are somewhat limited, like we pretty much all do, you're going to demand of the people around you that they at least pull their fair share of the weight, right? And so you could imagine that the people who were likely to feel a negative emotion of some sort for not chipping in and doing their share or more than their share, which would be a way of indicating their value to the community, were more likely to be, well, less likely to be selected as mates, and also perhaps more likely to be severely punished from time to time. Now, you might say, well, how do people get away with not being conscientious then? And well, the answer to that would be, there are other things that you can offer the community that are of value that aren't associated with dutifulness. And I think comedians are a good example of that. I don't believe that comedians are particularly conscientious, because it's not the kind of lifestyle you would pick if you were a conscientious person. Or people who go out on the road and play music, for example, because that's such an erratic lifestyle and so unlikely to be stable across any reasonable amount of time. So maybe you could be valuable to the community by being amusing. An extrovert would do that. Or by helping ensure security and safety, and maybe someone high in neuroticism would do that. Or maybe you would be useful because you're really good at developing affiliative relationships. That would be someone who is agreeable. Or you're creative. But the conscientious person demonstrates their value by working hard and being dutiful and contributing to the broader community and following rules and all that sort of thing. And there may be other things they do as well. So now here's a downside to being conscientious. If you're working in a big company, say, and there's mass layoffs and you happen to be affected independently of your work history, the probability that you'll become depressed is quite a lot higher if you're conscientious. And some of you may be conscientious people, and you know that if you fail at something, or even if you think you might be failing at something, you're going to tear yourself apart. You're going to find it, you're going to blame yourself for it, because conscientious people, especially orderly people, are also judgmental, right? And so, which is something the liberals always accuse the conservatives of doing, is being judgmental and laying down their value structure on everything. But if you're conscientious, you're going to tend to assume that if things aren't going well for you, that it's your fault.